Range missiles and the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Tonight, reporting from the site of the summit in Washington.
Good evening on this second day of the Reagan-Gorbachev summit, and with an arms control treaty well signed and certainly well publicized, the two leaders have moved on to the more difficult issues which still need to be resolved. Though the central focus of this summit continues to be arms control, the Soviet-American relationship needs to be managed on the ground as well. And today that meant talking not only about long-range missiles, but also about the regional issues. Primarily what is going to happen in Afghanistan. We begin with our White House correspondent, Sam Donaldson.
When the two leaders met at the White House today for their third working session of the summit, the growing warmth in the new Ron and Mikhail relationship was clearly evident. The president took Gorbachev into his private study just off the Oval Office for an 11-minute talk with only interpreters present. Aides said it was a personal conversation that was not negotiation, but set the stage for negotiation. And back in the Oval Office, the two got down to some difficult subjects, beginning with Afghanistan.
The fact that we are ready to withdraw from Afghanistan is something that I have said some time ago. So what we are going to discuss will be more specific.
But according to sources, Gorbachev did not set out a specific timetable in his meeting with the president. A working group has been set up to discuss such regional conflicts, but so far it has not produced any actual Soviet plan for withdrawal from Afghanistan that is new or more pleasing to Washington. Another working group is studying the problem with moving forward on a new treaty on arms control, one to cut long-range missiles by 50%. But again, sources say there is no real breakthroughs to report. And on the touchy subject of the U.S. Star Wars strategic defense program, Gorbachev and aides are said to have offered no real change in a fairly hardline Soviet position of opposing it. In fact, Gorbachev appeared to take back the admission in his NBC interview that the Soviets also were working on a Star Wars program. Still, on the basis of the chemistry between the two leaders today, the spokesman for each side sounded optimistic.
I think there's a very good feeling on both sides about where they're going. But the problem is that we're right in the middle. We haven't reached the point of conclusions yet.
That's maybe about the mood. You see, when the president and the general secretary left the Oval Room, I was in the way, and the general secretary smiled at me, and the president winked at me.
That was me.
Oh, sorry, I thought it was me.
The signing of a disarmament treaty yesterday is in itself enough to make this summit an historic success. But such have been the preliminary reports of progress and the hype over the personal chemistry between the two leaders that when the president addresses the nation from the Oval Office tomorrow night to report on the summit's outcome, many people may expect him to report on new successes. He may be able to do that. On the other hand, there may turn out to be nothing more here than a wink and a smile. Sam Donaldson, ABC News, the White House.
Joining us here tonight in Washington, the Secretary of State, George Shultz. Mr. Secretary, this town is clearly impressed with Mr. Gorbachev. Are expectations too high?
Well, I think it's right to be impressed with him. He's a very able person, energetic, amiable in his way, and somebody who's good to have a conversation with. So I think that's perfectly justifiable and obvious.
How is he from your point of view on the substance?
As far as the issues are concerned, the substance, I think everybody has to remember what we're dealing with are issues that are difficult, important, and complicated. So what we're doing is working at them in a business-like, problem-solving way. And they're tough.
Has he changed his mind about what he had to say on the Soviets having an ABM treaty program?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the content of the discussions because we've agreed not to until the end. All I think it is appropriate to say is we work at these very hard. We see a little progress here and there, but they're tough issues.
Okay, given the impressions, given the expectations of Mr. Gorbachev, give us at least some guidelines about what we should look for when this is over tomorrow.
Well, I should think you would want to stay awake and be ready to listen tomorrow afternoon. That's about the best guideline I can give you.
Perfectly happy to listen now if you'll tell us whether or not people are going to be happy or expectations will have to be reduced.
Well, it all depends on where your expectations are. As far as the meeting itself is concerned, of course, there has been an historic treaty signed. The subjects discussed cover the full range of the issues that we have set out and they have agreed to set out. We've had working groups. We've had good substantive discussions in every area, but none of them move along fast. It's a process of
In a phrase, no breakthroughs.
Steady as you go.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us. Secretary of State George Shultz. Mr. Gorbachev began this day in Washington with the leaders of the Congress. And there are many members of Congress who wish he'd addressed a joint meeting. But they do admit that the most anti-Soviet among them would have turned it into what they describe as a circus. No, it was just to be the leaders of the House and the Senate in the Soviet embassy. As ABC's Britt Hume reports, they were impressed.
Gorbachev showed the visiting congressional leaders that he understands at least one thing about dealing with Capitol Hill. Flattery helps.
We felt that contacts and meeting with the leaders of the U.S. Congress should be an important element of our program, because Congress is indeed a most important element in the political process in the United States of America.
After the cameras and mics were turned off, there was frank talk on such issues as Afghanistan, immigration, and other human rights issues. Gorbachev said he was sick of getting letters from the U.S. Congress on such matters. Still, the members were impressed, including some who had not wanted Gorbachev before a joint session of Congress.
We made our points, he made his points, but I think he's someone you can talk with.
You have to be impressed with the caliber of the man, and he's nobody's dummy, let's face it.
The General Secretary responded to every question that we made, I thought, with extremely good humor.
I'm very impressed with this man. I think he can hold his own in any debating forum.
But some in Congress are deeply suspicious of the man, the treaty, and what may come next. Republican Senator Wallop released a petition signed by more than 1,000 retired military leaders urging the Senate not approve the treaty as long as the Soviets violate past treaties. But Wallop's fellow Wyoming Republican, Minority Whip Simpson, said today he sees no more than 15 hard votes against this treaty.
I'm going to work my butt off to get it passed and ratified.
Simpson has taken the lead on this issue, at least for now, because Republican leader Dole, running for president and worried about conservative support, has been reluctant to back the treaty. He is expected eventually to do so. Britt Hume, ABC News on Capitol Hill.
In a moment, our summit coverage will continue.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, brought to you by Isotoner Comfort Slippers.
Okay, lady, let's find a gift for tired feet. You're the expert.
When you're looking for slippers with something extra, follow the expert. She knows that some slippers just cover the feet. But Isotoner Comfort Slippers gently massage tired feet. They'll feel relaxed all over. This Christmas, follow the expert. Give the gift of comfort. Isotoner Comfort Slippers.
Together, Shearson Lehman Brothers, E.F. Hutton. Together, we will be an investment firm of unrivaled strength, diversity, and stability, with nearly $4 billion in capital. Together, we will manage more than $100 billion in assets for our clients. Together, we will have an extraordinary opportunity. And this holiday season, our best wishes to all our colleagues and clients. Shearson Lehman Brothers and E.F. Hutton.
One thing about Mr. Gorbachev, he certainly doesn't let the grass grow under his feet. After 2 hours with the president and his meeting with Congress, Mr. Gorbachev went on to a lengthy lunch at the State Department, followed by a meeting with leading publishers and broadcasters. Mr. Gorbachev has a feel for public opinion. Here's ABC's Walter Rogers.
Kennedy up and down, as if wondering what kind of leader he'd make. Some brought Gorbachev's new book. This autograph could translate into one more vote for the INF treaty from Senator Domenici. But at lunch, Gorbachev was all business, stating a basic philosophical difference with President Reagan.
Peace from a position of strength is inherently unstable, whatever anyone might claim. By its very nature, it is based on confrontation.
Still, the lunch ended with a cordial toast. But later, at this meeting with American media executives, Mr. Gorbachev revealed another basic difference he has with President Reagan and many Americans on human rights.
So what moral right does the U.S. have to preach to us, to the rest of human society? Who gave them the right, the moral right, to preach? Yesterday I said to the President, Mr. President, you're not a prosecutor and I'm not an accused.
But before adjourning, Mr. Gorbachev counseled his American guests, let's not scold each other. In the midst of yesterday's treaty signing euphoria, Mr. Gorbachev and the President mentioned the enormous historic, cultural, and political differences that divide us. Today, those continuing differences were evident. Walter Rogers, ABC News, Washington.
Well, while the President and Mr. Gorbachev were meeting, Mrs. Gorbachev was keeping company with Mrs. Reagan. We cannot tell you how they get along in private. But in public, they do not seem to share the mutual enthusiasm which their husbands display. Here's ABC's Carol Simpson.
Mrs. Gorbachev arrived at the White House this morning for a tour and coffee with Mrs. Reagan. After posing for pictures, Mrs. Reagan began to usher Mrs. Gorbachev inside. But Mrs. Gorbachev, who couldn't resist the cameras, moved forward and began talking to reporters. Mrs. Reagan tried again to move things inside, but could only stand by in silence. Even before today, relations between them were chilly. Mrs. Reagan is said to find Mrs. Gorbachev dogmatic. She didn't like the fact that Mrs. Gorbachev showed up at the Reykjavik summit when it was understood neither would attend. And she thought it rude that Mrs. Gorbachev took 2 weeks to respond to her White House invitation. But today, the First Lady rejected any suggestion that she didn't like Mrs. Gorbachev.
So silly. This is a summit of pretty substantive issues.
Later, during the White House tour, Mrs. Gorbachev agreed that everything was fine between them. Yet on at least 2 occasions, Mrs. Reagan interrupted Mrs. Gorbachev to keep her from chatting with reporters.
And regrettably, I think we're going to have to move on.
The First Ladies then shared coffee, and White House officials said they talked about Mrs. Reagan's anti-drug campaign. At the summit press briefing, spokesman Marlon Fitzwater insisted the women got on well. So well, they kept their husbands waiting.
And they had to wait about 10 minutes for the First Ladies to finish the discussion they were having.
So they waited. Men waited for women.
Mrs. Gorbachev said today she looks forward to returning to the United States when she can see more of the country. Some White House folks said privately they hope when that time comes, she will have learned more about American etiquette. Carol Simpson, ABC News, Washington.
When we come back, Lawrence, Kansas, and the summit on the day after the arms treaty.
Phone calls, deadlines, stomach complaints, my job, and my Lanta 2.
Double strength my Lanta 2. Nearly double the acid neutralizing power of any leading brand.
Because my life takes my Lanta 2.
You may not have thought of buying a Sears Die-Hard battery until you've had a little time alone to think about it.
Not only is the 35mm Olympus Infinity totally autofocus, auto quick flash, auto everything, it's also totally weatherproof.
The Olympus Infinity, absolutely great pictures, absolutely no hassles.
And now, a word from a man who refuses to take the Drixoral his pharmacist recommends for 12 hours of cold relief. Drixoral, the pharmacist's favorite.
My baby don't care for shows. My baby don't care for clothes. My baby just cares for me. My baby don't care for cars and races. My baby don't care for...
Share the fantasy. Chanel number 5.
Those of us who've been here in Washington for the summit this week have obviously been caught up in all the minutiae as well as all the major events. It helps almost any time, if you spend too much time in this city, to take the temperature of the country elsewhere. ABC's Ken Kashiwahara has been to Lawrence, Kansas.
It is far removed from the centers of power. Lawrence, Kansas, in the center of America, with a typical Main Street.
a community Christmas play in rehearsal.
But more than most other towns in this part of the country, Lawrence is acutely aware of the summit, intensely interested in nuclear weapons because of a fantasy that hit close to home.
In the 1983 TV movie, The Day After, Lawrence was destroyed by Soviet missiles, its residents victims of a nuclear war.
It was our town that we saw. It was our lives that we saw being destroyed. And so it gives us, I think, a greater appreciation of the alternatives and a greater appreciation of the fact that some progress is being made.
Lawrence has become an advocate for peace, sending a delegation to Moscow, attempting to get the summit held in Kansas, hosting a delegation of Soviet athletes. And in the schools this week, students discussed and debated the summit and the INF Treaty. At the Sunset Hill Elementary School, there was hope.
Ronald Reagan thinks this is a quote-unquote good bargain, and I think this is too, because this is sort of breaking the ice for more treaties.
But despite the town's apparent single-mindedness, seniors at Lawrence High School were skeptical of the treaty.
We would destroy flexible response of NATO because there's no intermediate range between conventional forces and ICBMs.
The USSR has broken practically every single treaty, including economic treaties with Finland, for God's sake. So why would they really adhere to this? I mean, what's the point?
How many of you would vote for ratification?
But for residents who portrayed the film's nuclear victims, the events in Washington are reason for optimism.
It's really making me feel good inside because I know that, you know, we're doing something about it and, you know, we can save our kids.
Somehow we have got to rid this world of these terrible weapons.
They have seen their future fictionalized and this week gathered to pray it doesn't become reality. Ken Kashwahara, ABC News, Lawrence, Kansas.
Our next report is a reminder that even as Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. Reagan talk of arms control, the struggle between the two nations to get an edge in military technology has hardly missed a beat. As ABC's John Martin reports tonight, a series of costly mistakes apparently has given the Soviets a key piece of American military know-how.
It's one of the most important materials in nuclear weaponry, used in the nose cones of American intercontinental missiles, on the wings and nose of the space shuttle. It's called carbon-carbon, and because of its unique properties, it burns uniformly when missiles re-enter the atmosphere. Without it, the missiles can wobble and fall off target. With it, American missiles are believed to be 3 times more accurate than Soviet missiles.
But now, because of a bureaucratic blunder here and in Great Britain, the Soviet Union has managed to acquire key elements of American missile technology.
Carbon-carbon technology is right up there among the most serious losses that we've sustained in recent years.
Today, a House subcommittee closed its doors in secrecy to call military and intelligence experts to find out how this could have happened.
A major scandal and one of the greatest losses of technology we've ever had.
The matter lay idle in the hands of the CIA for 6 or 7 months, during which time nothing was done to address the problems.
What the Soviets got were furnaces and presses to heat and form the material. They came from the British subsidiary of this New Jersey firm called Consark. This man, James Metcalf, meeting with Soviet technicians in Scotland, agreed to sell them 9 vacuum induction furnaces and 2 isostatic presses in 1983.
The approval was written from the British government, and it was verbal from the U.S. government.
U.S. commerce officials approved the sale without seeing its national security implications. Then it took a year for CIA and Pentagon officials to learn of the deal. They reacted with alarm. They asked Britain to stop the sale. A year later, Secretary of Defense Weinberger told Congress it had been stopped, just in time. But as it turned out, Metcalf, married to a Soviet woman, had already shipped most of the equipment. This sketch, smuggled out of the Soviet Union, is said to be the design of a factory near Moscow. Experts believe it can make carbon-carbon. So, behind the symbolism of a summit, the superpower race for even the slightest edge in strategic missiles goes on relentlessly on both sides of the Iron Curtain. John Martin, ABC News, Washington.
We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's news.
If they could see you now out on a punch-up cruise, you're eating fancy food and doing what you choose. I'd like your friends back home to get a good look it where you are. What a fun ship, holy cow. They'd never believe it if your friends could see you now.
Take a 3, 4, or 7-day cruise on Carnival, the most popular cruise line in the world.
Give a gift of Riuniti, Riuniti Spumante, a gift box of Riuniti Apple, Raspberry, and Peach, or a gift box of Riuniti Red, White, Rosé, and Gold. And may all your holidays be bright.
For your love, oh, I would do anything. I would do anything for your love.
When it comes to the joy of giving, nothing makes you feel as good as gold.
Where does it hurt?
Here.
For indigestion, heartburn, and gas, nobody does as much as Malox Plus. Dose for dose, it neutralizes more than any regular strength antacid and dissolves gas. Nobody does as much as Malox Plus.
All the stars were there that night. My assignment, sneak some photos. I was packing my automatic, the Canon Sure Shot Supreme. She threw me a smile. He threw me his dinner. He missed his shot, but I got mine. Close-up shots, low-light shots. Thanks to my Sure Shot, I got every shot I wanted. And one I didn't want. The Canon Sure Shot Supreme.
Canon, official 35mm camera of the 1988 Winter Olympics.
Last night we reported that the crash of a Pacific Southwest Airlines jet on Monday may have been deliberately caused by a passenger with a gun. 43 people were killed when the jet crashed in Central California. As ABC's Tom Schell reports tonight, federal agents have found evidence which gives new weight to the theory.
Investigators at the crash site today found a gun in the wreckage.
Any connection between it and the crime that we suspect occurred on this aircraft will be more fully developed.
The cockpit voice recorder examined in Washington last night shows there was an unauthorized entry into the cockpit during the last moments of the flight. The FBI is also trying to learn everything they can about David Burke, a fired U.S. Air employee who allegedly smuggled a gun on the plane to kill his ex-boss in a murder-suicide revenge plot. Last night, FBI agents searched Burke's Long Beach, California condominium, where they found a will dated December 2nd. Police also say Burke kidnapped his ex-girlfriend and her daughter a few days ago, but released them unharmed. Burke's parents and former co-workers seem stunned by it all.
I feel upset and I feel heartbroken.
Been the last guy I would have guessed to do something like that.
Investigators did not say whether the cockpit voice recorder indicated shots were fired in the cockpit or whether the pilots had any control in the final moments. Tom Schell, ABC News.
There was a plane crash last night in Peru. A Navy plane carrying a Peruvian soccer team went down in the Pacific Ocean near the airport at Lima. There were 44 people on board, and it appears that only one person, the pilot, survived. In the Philippines today, dozens of soldiers captured the man who led a coup attempt last August against the government of Corazon Aquino. Colonel Gringo Honisan was arrested along with several other rebel leaders when troops raided an apartment in a suburb of Manila. In tonight's Money Matters, another up day on Wall Street. The Dow Jones Industrials gained another 34 points, and the trading was heavy. When we come back, nostalgia at the White House. The General Secretary sings after supper.
A lot of beautiful moments in life have been messed up by lousy photography. But this couldn't happen with the Nikon N4004. It's an autofocus, autoflash, 35mm SLR that makes it almost impossible to take a bad picture. The N4004. The only mistake you can make is buying something else.
Uncle Henry, I can't wait to see these pictures.
Now, fly Pan Am and get a companion ticket for half price when you buy a Nikon.
When I tell someone the MCI card is better than AT&T's, they look at me funny. So I tell them our card saves them up to 25%. Then they look angry. But not with me.
Until you call, you'll never know how much better a long-distance company can be.
I want to know where every dollar is going. And MCI tells me where every phone call is going. every single call.
Until you call, you'll never know how much better a long-distance company can be.
It's Red Lobster's new seafood trios.
1, 2, 3 seafood favorites on one dish, 3 different tastes, each one delish.
7 all-new seafood trios starting at $6.95.
Lobster leads our supreme trio, followed by fried shrimp from the sea. Oh my, those scallops make this platter sure to please. At Red Lobster, good things come in threes.
And treat your kids to their own child's trio, just $1.95.
Barring any last-minute surprises, tomorrow is the third and last day of this summit meeting. Mr. Gorbachev's day begins at breakfast with Vice President Bush. He then goes to the White House for a final series of meetings with President Reagan. Shortly after 2 o'clock Eastern Time, there'll be a formal departure ceremony for Mr. Gorbachev at the White House. Mr. Gorbachev will then hold a news conference in the late afternoon before he leaves Andrews Air Force Base on his way home. And tomorrow night at 9 Eastern Time, President Reagan will speak to the nation about his view as to how this summit went. ABC News will continue to provide live coverage of the major summit events. Finally, this evening, one of those moments at the summit which may not mean much in the long run, but which we'll all remember. This is what our cameras are usually allowed to see. The leaders posed by the fireplace, the handshake, and then at dinner, the toast. But once in a while, something spontaneous happens, as it did last night, after the president's state dinner. Van Cliburn is no stranger to Soviet audiences. He was in his early 20s in 1958 when he became the first American to win the prestigious Moscow Tchaikovsky piano competition. After his program was completed last night, Mrs. Gorbachev requested that he play a Soviet favorite, Moscow Nights. From the Gorbachevs, a glimpse of that nostalgia and emotion for which Russians are famous. That's our report on World News Tonight. I'm Peter Jennings. We'll be back here tomorrow. Have a nice evening. Good night.
This is ABC.